Greece, everyone is talking about it, but as always, if you haven't been following the story for the last 7 years or so, it's pretty tricky to get your head into unless you've got lots of time to do some research and catch up. Well, that's what I've been doing, so you don't have to. So here we go, the Greek debt crisis and why austerity doesn't work. Let's go back to 1981. Greece joined the European Union. Now, the European Union was set up between all these countries in Europe, funnily enough, to help foster cooperation and trade, but also so we would stop trying to kill one another. So far, so good. But the problem with all this awesome new trade was that every country had a different currency. So when Italy traded with Germany, a percentage of that profit went to whoever was exchanging the money from one currency to the next. That's when the idea of a single currency that everyone could use popped up and the euro came into existence. So a majority of the countries in Europe gave up what currency they were using and moved over to the euro. But they did more than just give up their currency. They also gave up control of their monetary policy to the newly created European Central Bank. Monetary policy is basically control over how much money is in the economy, but also what level interest rates are set at, which is the amount of extra money you have to pay back in a loan if you borrow some cash. Greece joined the euro in 2001 and is one of the first countries to roll out the new money in 2002 when the euro became a thing. But Greece was running a deficit, meaning that it was spending more money than it was raising in tax. But hey, most countries were at that time. A big part of this was because many of the rich people living in Greece refused to pay their tax, find ways to avoid doing so, and have a history of bribing tax inspectors to look the other way while they stash away their money. It's estimated that the wealthy in Greece avoid paying about 15 billion euros in taxes every year. Contrary to how it has been portrayed in some media outlets, the crisis has more to do with the rich not paying their fair share than the poor being lazy and expecting everything to be handed to them. In actual fact, Greek workers on average work more hours per week than North American workers do. So between bad decision making, corrupt government officials and an upper class unwilling to pay tax, Greece was running a deficit. This means it had to borrow money from other countries to continue spending what it was, which it did. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing either. Developed countries have an advantage over developing countries in that when they borrow money, it's generally expected that they'll be able to pay it back, so the interest rates on those loans are lower. This means it can be advantageous to run a deficit sometimes if you use the money to stimulate the economy in such a way that it grows faster than the interest rates, meaning you can give the country a boost and pay back the debt. If you look back to after the Second World War, the UK was running a deficit of 200% of our GDP. That's gross domestic product, or a way of essentially looking at how much wealth a country is creating. And despite a deficit that huge, we still founded the NHS and grew a way out of it. By December of 2013, the UK's deficit was only 76% of GDP, to give you some context. But wait, I hear you ask. If the deficit was so much worse back after the Second World War, but we actually increased public spending, why then are we cutting public services now to try get out of it this time? Yeah, we're going to come back to that. But first, Greece. As a developed country who is now part of the EU, they got cheap debt on the understanding that they could pay it back, but also that if they couldn't, the EU was there to back them up. See, while the EU had control over monetary policy, each country still had control over their fiscal policy, meaning that they have control of their own tax rates and what the money is spent on, and spend they did using the borrowed money to stimulate the economy. That was until the financial crash in 2007-2008. Suddenly, it isn't sustainable to run a deficit, and everybody in the EU who's been lending money to everyone else wants their money back now. But Greece can't pay it back right now because the two dominant governments, New Democracy on the right and PASOK on the left, have been overspending and failed to make any decent reforms when they were rolling in cheap money. So the markets lose faith in Greece, meaning that those interest rates and borrowing start to skyrocket, which obviously means that now they have to pay back more money than they did before, so they need to borrow additional money to pay off that new, more expensive debt, then more money to pay off that more expensive debt, then more money to pay off that more expensive debt, and so on and so on and so on and so on. You start to wonder how that makes any sense. But that's how the banks reacted, pushing Greece down to the point that it becomes literally impossible to pay back the debt. So in steps Germany with a bailout package. See, now that everyone is using the euro and borrowing from one another, the economies of all these countries are intertwined. So if one country goes under, it'll have big implications for everyone else. If anything, it was kind of one of the founding ideas behind the European Union in the first place. So a bailout package appears, but with some requirements, namely austerity. So what is austerity? Basically, it's reducing public spending by a lot, in this case, to try and move Greece out of a deficit and into a surplus where the government is getting more in tax receipts than it is spending. And Greece largely succeeded and turned its deficit into a primary surplus. Except the problem is, austerity doesn't work. It never has. Reports from the IMF have shown that the more austerity is imposed on a country, the more damage it does to GDP growth. And it seems like such a no-brainer too, because when spending is decreased so drastically with money flowing out of the country to pay back foreign banks, it means that jobs disappear and wages drop because people spend less. And when people spend less, earn less and have no job, the country raises less tax than before, making the situation worse. Again, looking back to when we started the NHS, we were in a much worse deficit than Greece, but spent our way out of it. Economists have repeatedly said that austerity does not work. So Germany saying that they'll bail out Greece as long as they follow these austerity measures is basically the same as a friend coming to you 2 days before they get paid, asking to borrow 50 quid, which you say you'll give them, but only if they take a wage reduction. So by the time their next payday comes around, the situation is even worse, and they can't pay back that 50 quid anymore. But Greece accepted the bailout mid-2010, entering into loan agreements with creditors including other European countries, the IMF and the ECB, and accepted the harsh austerity that came with it, and unsurprisingly things got worse. By February of this year, unemployment in Greece is over 25%, with that rising to over 55% for young folk. A third of the country are living in poverty, and they have the highest child poverty in Europe, not to mention suicide rates have risen by 12%. So where the hell did all the money from those bailouts go? Why didn't it help? Well, it didn't help because of the 240 billion euros given to Greece, less than 10% of it actually went to the Greek government to reform the economy and protect the most vulnerable in society. Pretty much the majority of it went to the banks, who lent more than they should have for short-term gain. And I'm not talking about the Greek banks here. I mean the banks across Europe who lent to Greece's banks, even though they knew that it was extremely risky. So another way to look at it is that the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank, collectively known as the Troika, bailed out banks in their own countries who had lent recklessly to a Greek government with a history of overspending, but now expect the Greek people to pick up the tab by forcing the failed economic idea of austerity onto the folk at the bottom who actually do pay their taxes. Is it any wonder the Greek people are pissed off? So this was the situation, and now up pop a new far-left party called Syriza, who have found overwhelming support across Greece, who understand that austerity only makes things worse, and have effectively said to the Troika that it won't punish the Greek people for the mistakes of others any longer. In fact, Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister, has pointed out that the country was insolvent back in 2010, but the Troika lent them the money anyway, knowing it could never get it back. So now a referendum has been called for the people of Greece to decide whether or not they want to accept further harsh austerity from Europe in exchange for a further bailout, or if it wants to reject it, which might result in Greece leaving the euro. The thing is that if the debt was cancelled, Greece would have the chance to start fresh, a move that many economists and politicians are now backing, except that Germany won't back down and let this happen. That would be Germany, who had its own debt cancelled and aid provided to it after the Second World War, allowing its economy to recover. That's pretty cool, Germany. Greece stands against austerity and looks like it will vote against austere measures being put in place, measures that will only hurt those who have suffered the most under the poor decisions of others already. Cancelling the debt is not only the most humane option left, it might be the only option left. The way that the world deals with debt isn't working, and we should be supporting a party that says that what has happened in Greece, in Argentina, in Spain and across the world is the result of a broken system that needs to be fixed. Playing into the hands of that system even further, like the UK government is currently doing right now, will only result in more problems. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this roundup of what is happening in Greece, you can follow me and Left Scotland on Twitter and Facebook. As always, please do like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you all again soon.